The Icons of Real Estate Podcast. Are you ready to learn the proven money-making secrets from top-producing icon agents? Ready to skyrocket your business? This podcast is for you. Tune in every week with your host, Tomasz Fonseca, and find out how to implement proven strategies to 10 times your business, from $3 million to $30 million in just 12 months. Brought to you by the Masters in Real Estate Marketing, Arter SEO.
So welcome to another episode of the Icons of Real Estate podcast, where we highlight top professionals who are making waves in the industry. I'm your host, Karen Roberts, and today we're joined by Chuck Piro from MyNHD, a top provider of natural hazard disclosures with over 20 years of experience, known for their speed, accuracy, and commitment to client protection. MyNHD offers both residential and commercial reports backed by $10 million in E&O insurance to cover all transaction parties. Their safe harbor provision also transfers liability, adding extra peace of mind. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, would you like to share a little bit of the company history and you know, what was the inspiration behind starting a company like this?
Well, back in 1998, there was a law passed in California that made it mandatory for sellers of real estate to disclose to potential buyers if the properties that they were interested in purchasing were located in a mapped natural hazard zone. Natural hazards would include floods, fires, and earthquakes. And this was spurred by events in California. In particular, in 1991, there was a horrible wildfire in Oakland, in an area called Oakland Hills, where 2,800 homes were destroyed. 25 people lost their lives, and that spurred this movement that people should be made aware of the fact that the homes that they're purchasing are in these mapped hazard zones. Now, this information that we collect is not proprietary. In fact, it's all publicly available information. So sellers need to disclose to potential buyers as a result of a law that took effect in 1998, if the property is located within 6 natural hazard zones that are mapped, publicly available. The problem with that would be that sellers would have a difficult time assessing that information, even though it's publicly available. It would take them days, if not longer, to assess this information. These people certainly aren't experts at reading maps because these maps are very detailed. So that law prompted or caused an industry to be created that MyNHD was part of. So MyNHD creates the reports in the legally mandatory format and provides those reports to sellers to offer to a buyer, so a buyer could then evaluate their risk assessment before purchasing a property.
And in the last 20 years, how have things evolved?
Well, actually, it's the last 26 years because the law took effect in June of 1998. And back then, there was only 6 hazards that were really mandated to be disclosed. There were 2 flood zones. One's just called a regular flood zone. And every property in the United States is in a flood zone of some designation. The law only requires sellers to disclose if your property is located in a flood zone A, the letter A, or a flood zone V. Now, flood zone A's are all over the place, inland, all over the place. Flood zone V's, as in Victor, or velocity, are properties that front the ocean, oceanfront properties. So when there is the occurrence of a high tide and a storm, these properties are prone to flood. So a person would want to know prior to purchasing a property if their property was in a flood zone. Number one reason is because if they're using a lender is going to require the purchaser to purchase flood insurance, and that could be quite costly. The second flood zone is called an area of potential flooding, and that simply means that the property is downstream from a reservoir that's held by a dam. And the spirit of this zone is if the reservoir was 100% full and the dam had 100% failure, where would that water go? And if that water would hit the subject property, then the disclosure would be, yes, this property is in an area of potential flooding, or more precisely, a dam inundation zone. And that needs to be disclosed to a potential buyer. The good news about that is that typically lenders do not require the homeowner to purchase any additional insurance, flood insurance, if they're in an area of potential flooding. Moving on, there are two fire zones. One's called one fire zone is a local responsibility area, meaning that the property is in a developed area, and if there's a fire at that property, the local fire department would respond. However, there's another fire zone called a wildland fire area, and these are going to be areas that are outside the city in more rural areas where it's not the state's responsibility to provide fire department services to buildings and structures. So CAL FIRE in California, CAL FIRE would respond to those fires. Nonetheless, a person needs to be told if their property is in a fire zone, because if it is, that triggers other responsibilities of the seller or the buyer to make sure their property is like defensible space, like they've taken care of the property, so the risk of fire is greatly reduced. And then the last two are going to be a seismic hazard zone that would have to do with landslides and tsunamis and those types of things. And the last one would be, certainly apropos in California, an earthquake fault zone. Is the property in a mapped earthquake fault zone? So those are the 6 required disclosures on a natural hazard disclosure report that's required by the state.
And so can you explain the importance of these natural hazard disclosures and how they protect both the buyers and the sellers in real estate transactions?
Absolutely. You know, and then this goes for not only just Mr. and Mrs. Home buyer, but also investors and conglomerates that purchase real estate for various reasons. Okay, investments, etc. The last thing that you want to hear, or that the seller wants to hear from a buyer, would be, why didn't you tell me that this property was subject to, say, a landslide? Why didn't you tell me this property was in a landslide zone? Because there was a landslide that damaged or destroyed the house on the property. Why didn't you tell me this house was in a flood zone? Because there was a flood that damaged my property. So you can see that there could be a lot of questions after the sale of why didn't you tell me? So a natural hazard disclosure report eliminates those types of lawsuits of why didn't you tell me? The seller can assess their own risk of buying properties that are in natural hazard disclosure zones or natural hazard zones. And what a natural hazard disclosure company does, like MyNHD, is that we prepare the report in compliance with California law, and we guarantee that that report is correct in our assessment. So we're going to say, yes, this property is in this zone, so that the buyer buys that property knowing what's going on. You'll never get a "why didn't you tell me" lawsuit when you use a report from our company that comes out of the natural hazard disclosure industry in California. Now, the unique thing about MyNHD is that we can prepare a report for any property in the United States, no matter where it is. It's a mandatory report in California, but we can still prepare reports in other states and give you information relative to what's mapped as far as a natural hazard. So it protects all parties in the transaction. And I think that the number one reason people get sued in a real estate transaction is going to be lack of disclosure or wrong disclosures. And this is one big part of that.
And so without one, does this affect the insurance?
Oh, that could, absolutely. Yeah. If your house was damaged by an earthquake, why didn't you tell me? You can buy earthquake insurance, but at least you went into that transaction knowing that you were in a landslide zone, or an earthquake zone. Earthquakes are obviously California is probably famous for earthquakes. But the funny thing is that an earthquake fault zone is only a quarter of a mile wide, or about 1,320 feet wide. If you're in that area, your natural hazard report that's going to go to the buyer is going to say, yes, this house is in an earthquake fault zone. However, damage done in the event of an earthquake would extend far beyond that 1,320 feet zone. It could go 100 miles away. You could suffer damage. But the way the law states it, you only have to disclose it if you're in the mapped earthquake zone. Okay.
Right.
Fire zones are a lot broader. Flood zones could be a lot broader. Earthquake zones can do damage, but it's limited in the scope.
Okay. And so I would presume there's a few misconceptions around these NHDs that you may encounter from other real estate professionals or clients. So what are some of the common misconceptions around them?
Well, that's a great question. So somebody moves to California from a different state, and they receive a report as a buyer, and it's like, oh my God, this house is in an earthquake fault zone. And of course, their anxiety peaks, and they worry about, what does that mean to me? My explanation of that's a pretty simple one. In a typical real estate transaction, a buyer would put up, say, 20%. Let's just call it $1 million house for purposes of ease. $1 million house, a buyer comes in, puts up $200,000, and then a lender puts up $800,000. Who has more skin in the game? Obviously, it's the lender. Wants to protect their investment in this property as well. If they thought that they were, if they thought the risk of an earthquake was really high, they would require the buyer to purchase earthquake insurance. They don't do that. The only time a lender requires insurance would be if you're in a flood zone, not an earthquake zone, not a landslide zone. It would be a fire zone. And of course, now, because of fire, it's going to be fire zones. So fire zones and flood zones are going to require insurance. That would be something the buyer would want to know. Now, every house needs to have fire insurance if you have a mortgage. But even if you buy your house outright, this would be something that would be a concern to you. So when it comes to earthquakes, if the bank doesn't require it, I think that should put some amount of ease to a buyer, that the bank, who's got more skin in the game than the buyer, isn't requiring this. I know that my mortgage holder sends me a letter once a year, and I'm not in an earthquake fault zone. Nonetheless, I get a letter once a year from my mortgage holder asking me if I want to purchase additional insurance, like earthquake insurance. And although I have felt hundreds of earthquakes in my years in California, I've not opted to buy earthquake insurance. Right. But it's an option.
There you go, when you need the option. So how does MyNHD ensure the accuracy and the reliability of these disclosure reports provided to your clients?
That's another good question. Like I said earlier, all of this information is publicly available. Nothing proprietary. We do not prepare the maps. The maps are prepared by different government agencies. There's federal agencies, that would be the FEMA maps or the flood maps. There are state agencies, that's going to be like CAL FIRE. And then there are local agencies like counties that also prepare maps for their own business and their businesses. So we read maps. That's what we do. And we guarantee the accuracy of our map readers and our advanced technologies to make sure we're 100% correct. We don't want to be wrong because the liability is on us. So the value of a natural hazard disclosure company like MyNHD for the seller is the transfer of liability on disclosure of this information away from them and onto a company like MyNHD. And what we do is we provide the seller, the seller's agent, and everybody associated on the seller side on this transaction. They become additionally insurers under our errors and omissions insurance policy, which you mentioned earlier is $10 million. So if there was an error on the report caused by us making the wrong determination, and then there was an occurrence where there was damage done, we've got you covered with $10 million of insurance. We've never been sued because we don't make mistakes. And the good thing about our company, MyNHD, is we have a collection of some of the best experts in California preparing our reports and representing real estate agents and sellers. Mostly we interact with real estate agents. We're in kind of a unique situation that we don't really talk to sellers in this transaction unless, of course, they have questions concerning the report. And then we would get involved, whether it be questions from the seller or the buyer. But real estate agents really are the middleman between our company and the seller of the property or the buyer of the property.
Right. So can you share a memorable case where MyNHD services made a real significant impact on a real estate transaction?
Sure. Like somebody wants, like, purchase a property and say they want to build a pool, okay, and then they get the report, and the report would say, "Hey, you're in a landslide zone," and that may eliminate the possibility of getting permits to build the pool. So that would be something that you would want to know prior. Okay, I live on in a flood area, like a flood control channel. Well, in the event of high rains and stuff that erodes the bank, that's just the kind of stuff that these reports are good for, is future planning. Now, when it comes to these zones, it's not unusual or unique for a zone to change. For example, FEMA flood zones can and do change. You can buy a property that when you purchased it was not in a flood zone, and then FEMA may update the maps at a different point in time, and all of a sudden now your house is in a flood zone. Then you're going to be served with some kind of correspondence saying that now you're in a flood zone and you're going to have to pay flood insurance. On the other side of that, perhaps you purchased a house in a flood zone, they remap that area, and now your house isn't in a flood zone and insurance is no longer required. With MyNHD, we have a mechanism where you can access a website and look at actually the map of the flood zone in relationship to your house to see if it's close to your house, or if it doesn't even look on the map, then you'd be far out of the zone. But nonetheless, we provide tools that provide the buyer to click on a QR code, look at a map, and see exactly where these zones are in relationship to the property. This is just awareness of what's going on. It's protection for the seller that has to comply with these laws, and it's heads up to the buyer so you know where you're going with the risk in purchasing property. Not only, like I said, only buyers and single buyers, but groups and associations and investors information that they want to know.
Right. And so without them, you're risking being sued. That's what I'm hearing. That's the biggie.
That's exactly, we do the work so you don't have to worry about a lawsuit. Yeah. Look, in California, there's several disclosures that need to be made. This is just one of the categories is natural hazards disclosures. There's another disclosures that sellers need to make. It's called a transfer disclosure statement. On a transfer disclosure statement, that's a document that the seller by himself fills out based on their actual knowledge of the property in which they live, that they're letting the buyer know, hey, this is what's going on with my property. Like there's a crack in the backyard patio. I'm just letting you know there's a crack in the patio. Oh, that stain up in the ceiling, that was done because there was a leak in pipes up there and we had it fixed. We didn't paint the ceiling, but that's what's going on. The backyard hose bib leaks. We haven't fixed it. This is a transfer disclosure statement that every seller fills out. Okay. The natural hazard disclosure, people don't know this stuff. And for anybody, a buyer or seller, to go research this stuff, or even an agent to go do this, because agents have liability in California, not just the seller. The seller's agent is also liable to disclose natural hazards disclosures. The amount of time it would take a seller/agent to decipher this information and prepare the report in the necessary format would be way too time consuming. And the chance of them making a mistake by reading a map, who wants that liability? Nobody wants that liability. So our company assumes all that liability so that the seller has none. That's the joy of these reports and from our company. Absolutely.
And peace of mind.
Peace of mind.
Peace of mind. So, look, thank you for explaining that. And I'm sure there's people, after the hurricanes that they've had over in Florida, that many people may have come unstuck there too. So, but our final question is always more of a fun one, because here at Icons, we're not just a podcast network, we're a podcast production company as well. So we are trying to make it accessible for everybody involved in the real estate business to use podcasting. So if you had your own podcast as a company, what do you think you'd call it?
What would I call my podcast company? Thanks, Karen. Let me see. What would I call? I don't know. I'm blank on that. What I would call.
MyNHD. So it's got to be an alignment.
MyNHD. You know what? Here's another thing. If I could just add another element to this real quickly. Not only do sellers need to disclose natural hazards, they have to disclose taxes and assessments. Okay. In California, if we have a couple of minutes, so I got a minute or two.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. In California, there's areas that are called Mello-Roos districts or community facilities districts. These are new developments. And new developments, because they can't get money from the state, they sell bonds in which to build these communities. And these bonds help to create schools and infrastructure and police departments and hospitals, etc., in these big, large communities. When you purchase property in those developments, you pay extra to pay off those bonds. They're called Mello-Roos bonds. That's another disclosure that needs to be made, because that could cost a seller an additional, I don't know, $3,000, $5,000, $6,000 annually on top of their property taxes. So the MyNHD report also has a tax section that discloses how much the taxes are going to be and how long those taxes will be in effect, and what those taxes are used for. Typically, those are 25-year bonds. But if you buy a property, perhaps you're buying it from somebody that's already lived there for 10 or 15 years. You don't go back to day one and start, you go from where the seller left off. So you may only have 5 more years of that assessment. If you don't tell a buyer that information, that's another lawsuit that's waiting to happen. Why didn't you tell me there were actually more assessments and more taxes on my property? But taxes and assessments and environmental hazards like leaking underground storage tanks, etc., around the subject property, taxes and assessments about the subject property. Okay, so it's a very comprehensive report that protects the seller. Okay, so
and it's going to protect.
Yeah,
it's going to protect all the real estate agents. So for them, they need to get hold of these reports when they are selling houses. So how do they get in touch with you? How do they reach you so that they can get them?
well, you can go to MyNHD, MyNHD.com. And if anybody wants a free report on a property across the United States, you can request a free report as a sample on a listing that you might have. But we don't want it just on a random piece of property. But if you have a listing and you want to get, you want to see what one of these reports look like, email support@mynhd.com, and we'll make sure that you get a report sent to you. Okay. And if I was going to name my company, it would be Risk Free NHD.
There it is. Perfect. Wonderful. And what a great way to finish this. So thank you for your time today. Very interesting subject today, slightly different to our normal podcast. And it's something that every real estate agent needs to get their hands on. So get in touch.
Absolutely.
I will be back next time with the Icons of Real Estate podcast. Bye for now.